Part of globalization was we pay the defense costs that allow your economies to advance for the first time in your history in many cases. And that's been 75 years. That's the world we all know. And specifically, we've all become used to the last 35 years. The Chinese entered the system with 1 billion workers, pushing down the cost of manufactured goods. And the collapse of the Soviet system dumped an empire of raw materials on the system at the same time. And so that 30-year period since 1990, when we've had cheaper and cheaper and cheaper manufactured goods and low inflation in commodity prices, this is like the sum total of most of our business experience. This is the most atypical period in human history. It was always going to last for a historical moment, and the historical moment is now ending. We now have to do something a little bit more normal. The two factors you need to look at are demographics and geography. What you're looking at here is just a map of the waterways and the farmlands of the United States. Those blue lines, the greater Mississippi, the intracoastal, all the attached rivers, that is more miles of navigable waterway than the rest of the planet combined, about 13,000 miles. We have the lowest cost for internal transport on the planet, and it should be lower because of the Jones Act. We basically told all foreigners that they couldn't participate in our water transport. You guys, I think, can imagine what would happen to trucking and trains and aerospace if we did that. Oh my God, what a shit show that would be. But we've done it for water. So we've taken our single biggest geographic advantage, and now water transport's only like single digits of our total transport. If we just brought that back in a meaningful way, the pressure on every other part of the transportation system would lessen. The economic explosion we would see at any place you see blue on this map would have runaway growth, especially since we're in an environment where we need to double the size of the industrial plant. It would all go to the places that are blue. We can have stuff or not. That's the choice here. How we get there, that's the problem. Now, obviously, things like automation can help, but so this is our demographic structure here. You've got the boomers at the top. They're the ones who are retiring. On average, the boomers will have retired in the fourth quarter of this year. This is not a hazy future thing. This is the here and now. And they're being replaced by the Zoomers there at the bottom. They're the smallest generation we've ever had. This calendar year, we're looking at a shortage of 400,000 workers. But all the Zoomers are already born. We know exactly what the inflow to the market's going to look like for the next 20 years. We know that 400,000 shortage is going to increase every year for at least the next 12. And then it'll probably peak at about 1 million shortage in 2034. So, if I could give you any advice, higher now. I don't care what it costs, because it's going to be more next year and the year after and the year after until we get to 2034. And then it'll start to fall back probably. The labor crunch that we're seeing here is nothing compared to what the rest of the world is dealing with. Fuck. It's like, we always knew that the German economic model was going to end this decade, independent of the Ukraine war. We always knew that the Chinese had the fastest aging society in history before the data revisions. This is it. It's us, it's France, it's New Zealand. We're the only countries that have a semi-normal demographic structure. And, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to guess that the French are going to keep it to themselves. And New Zealand is like 4 people. We either have the stuff when we build it ourselves, or we don't have the stuff because it's not coming from anywhere else. So we have a choice between high inflation and high growth that ends us with supply chains that are closer, simpler, employed by locals, more productive, greener, more reactive, and immune to international pressure, or high inflation and no stuff. Those are our choices. This is not a hard discussion. Oh, thank God for Mexico. You'll notice it's not perfect. When you get down to about the 30-year-olds, it goes straight down, because Mexico is simply the most recent country to follow this pattern. It used to be in the pre-globalized world that most people lived on farms. And eventually you get more of a chimney graphic like we have, or in the case of places like Germany or China, it starts to invert in. Mexico started this process just like everyone else, but they didn't start this process until about 1995. So that's where it goes straight down. The birth rate dropped by half. They never recovered. They probably never will. And net migration to the United States has been negative for the last 12 of the last 13 years. But they are the last one to start down this road. Of the major countries in the world, the last one. Now, they have the healthiest demography in not just the rich world, but in their own income class. They're better than Brazil. They're better than Turkey. They're better than India. And if they keep aging at this rate, they will become older on average than the average American in the 2050s, maybe 2060s. a lot of things can happen between here and there. But we have the slowest aging demography of the advanced world and the advanced developing world, and Mexico's second. This is exactly the sort of partner that we want. So we can have a system that's driven by finance, that's driven by high-skilled labor, that has excellent transport systems, that partners with a country that is lower on the development index, but can help us with the low and the mid-end manufacturing. And this is really important for things like automotive and aerospace and electronics. And then we will have to tap a few places here and there around the world. But for the most part, we can keep this within North America or within the Western Hemisphere at worst. No one else has anything that's even close to that. But the sort of transport you integrate with a country like Mexico or, say, Colombia, which I think will do well, or Cuba, which I think ultimately will come in from the cold, is different than these massive container vessels that ply the Pacific. And it's a different way of operating. And the sooner we start the transition, the lower inflation it's going to be. If we can reform Jones, we can bring manufacturing back on the water in the United States in a very big way. Mexico has now become so advanced. On a labor productivity measure, Mexico is now ahead of Canada. Sorry, Canadians, but that's where we are. Which means that Mexico now needs a low-cost, low-wage partner. Isn't that hilarious? It's like Mexico basically needs a 1980s Mexico. Colombia and Cuba are the obvious candidates. They're close. We already have a free trade agreement with Colombia. I cannot think of a better way to destroy Castro's legacy than to integrate with it. Oh my God. It's like the whole thing would just be wiped away in months. That's my vote, but whatever. But it's a much simpler system that is reliant on things close to home. Because if you want to have a trade deal with, say, China or the European Union, you're negotiating among near peers there. It's kind of a pain in the ass. And then there's always pushback. But when you integrate with a place like Colombia that's just kind of desperate and happy to be part of the club, it's a much easier process. And so you don't need to do things at scale to the same degree. A small container ship is fine. You don't need the massive stuff. Pros, I'd say we've already shown that it can be done. The Texans have been doing this for 30 years now. Half of our trade with Mexico is via Texas. It's not that the cartels are not a real threat. And it's not that as long as we love our cocaine, we're not going to keep fueling them, because that's exactly where this comes from. It's not, the cartels did not just magically appear in Mexico. They're kind of at least half our fault. But the places where there's violence is only 1 or 2% of the country at any given time. So if you have a security staff who can keep their ear to the ground and knows what they're doing, you know when the violence is coming your way. And at the moment, the cartels have not expressed an interest in interfering with trade because it's not to their benefit. The Sinaloa, which is the most powerful one, would see that specifically as a death blow to drug trafficking, which is their reason to be. And the second most powerful one, the Jalisco New Generation, sees violence as more of an end as opposed to a means to the end, and going after trucking and manufacturing doesn't get them anything. I don't want to say the risk is zero, because it's absolutely not, but they don't see a business model for interfering with trade aside from just wanting to get access to the plazas. In terms of how you do it, northern Mexico is desert and highland, which means there aren't a lot of farms, there aren't a lot of small towns. So the normal ebb and flow of populations that we have in the United States and Canada, it's very different. Here, when a city starts to develop and really industrialize in a big way and get into manufacturing, they start drawing labor from other communities that are nearby. In northern Mexico, there are no other communities. So pros and cons. The pro is that there's usually just a handful of families who run the entire metro, and that metro stops at the edge of the desert, and that's it. Now, that means that as a American, you can go south with your needs, find out who's in charge, make friends, and you will probably leave in a few days with a series of supply contracts, because they represent the power board, the mayor's office, the tax office, the university, the local labor unions. It's all in one little package. It's very oligarchic. We don't like that here, but wow, is it easy to interface with when you want to do business. You'll leave with those deals, probably a godchild and absolutely a splitting hangover, because you're part of the family now. And the Texans have been doing this for 30 years. But once you've gobbled up all the labor for each metro, you're done. The Mexicans aren't mobile like we are because they don't have those secondary communities in the north. Well, there's only 130 million Mexicans. About a quarter of those are in the northern states that we have the most experience with. And I would argue that the Texans have already gobbled up about 70 to 75% of that labor. So there's a limited window for everyone else to get in on northern Mexico, where the logistics are simpler, where the politics are simpler. Once that is gobbled up, and at the rate we're going, that's in less than 2 or 3 years, we then have to go into central Mexico, which is a much different environment. And now you're dealing with people like AMLO. Now you're dealing with not so much oligarchs, but a more connected community that has its own weight. It's not that that can't be productive. It's wildly productive, but it's a much more complicated launch process that requires a lot more negotiation, a lot more government involvement.